English translation 510th contact. Saturday, 18th of December 2010, 14.58 hours.
Today, while proofreading, I noticed that Bernadette made more mistakes than usual when reading the reports. I think you should tell her to read a little slower. Since I always record the proofreading work, it also contains the mistakes of the promises, which I have to remove afterwards to have a clear record.
Sometimes she gets lost in the speed, but I will draw her attention to your request. We have finished the Talmud work, so if I could ask you a few questions?
In any case, it saves me extra work, which can be avoided if Bernadette is careful not to get too involved in promises. But on my last visit you wanted to ask me something about Pope Joan.
Correct. As I said recently, I was asked about Pope Joan and whether you might know more than we Earthlings know. I also read the following in a journal, Vicus Papessa, who was the Pope that must not exist. The alley, Vicus Papessa, the Pope's Alley, which existed in the Middle Ages between Via dei Santi Quattro Coronati and the Colosseum, has long become a legend. According to this legend, the girl Joan dressed up as a monk, which gave her the opportunity to study. His erudition finally made him Pope in 855, succeeding Pope Leo IV. And although Benedict III is next in line in the Pope's list, many historians believe that he was invented by the Catholic Church, and therefore there is also little record of him in the archives. Well, I have written the following about this in Spiritual Teaching Letter number 80, under Interesting Facts from History.
Apart from such incidents at the Holy See in Rome, there are also things that can justify a smile, even if the sad end is again written in blood. For example, the story of Pope John VIII, who held the papal throne for 2 years, 7 months and 4 days as His Holiness and Divinity. At that time, the pious and highly educated man John VIII was unanimously elected and was highly revered and loved by the people as his divinity. Until the unbelievable happened, which could never be true, and which is therefore withheld from the faithful and vehemently denied by the Catholic Church until today. It was in Italy in the 9th century, when the country in the south was shaken by huge, destructive earthquakes, while black clouds of huge swarms of locusts swept over Rome, only to fall exhausted into the water far out in the sea and perish. Washed back to shore, the rotting and stinking carcasses triggered epidemics that claimed many lives. It was a year of catastrophes and widespread death, as such years pass over the earth sporadically, born of entirely natural causes, caused by climatic upheavals and unusual weather conditions, such as droughts, cold spells, continuous rain, hail, storms and snow, etc. The human beings, however, at that time still believing in ghosts and demons in an insane form, in a life-threatening mass, and many times worse than today, were caught up in the mistaken belief of the heresies preached by the Catholic Church. So it was not surprising that the wildest rumors were circulating, and even allegations were made that a rain of blood had fallen in France, which must be regarded as God's punishment. Such and many other rumors of a sectarian nature were circulating in the Eternal City. Gradually, the panic of the masses became more and more widespread, as they found themselves at the mercy of the powerful and avenging power of God, who apparently took revenge by punishing the human beings for some incomprehensible events and actions. So the angry people cried out for the Pope more and more often, and demanded that he do something against the revenge and punishment of God, being he his representative on earth. So he had no choice but to show himself to the angry people several times. This was also the case in 857, when he had to publicly appease the mighty wrath of God with prayers, after having done the same thing several times for more than 2 years, which he had already spent in the chair of Peter. He often lovingly appeased the angry people and prayed with them to God in all the heavens to dissuade them from their anger and vengeance against the human beings. And the people thanked him for this, and worshipped and loved him, until that day when the incomprehensible happened, which in one part makes you laugh, despite the bitter bloody end. Once again, Pope John VIII stood among the people of his faithful, walking in procession from St. Peter's Basilica to the papal Lateran residence, cheered by his flocks and striding majestically when it suddenly happened. Between the church of San Clemente and the Colosseum, in a narrow alleyway, the monstrous and incomprehensible happened. The Pope suddenly began to stagger, waving his hands in the air in search of support, and simply collapsed. Sounds of wailing came over his lips, and then the second unbelievable monstrosity happened, which made the people groan, at first completely unable to understand and comprehend what was going on in front of their own eyes and what they really saw. In fact, something was moving under the Pope's clothes, and the Pope lifted his clothes up, while bright horror raced through the bystanders. It was actually not to be missed that the Pope gave birth to a child, a boy. The Pope was a woman. Pope John VIII, lying on the ground, turned out to be a woman who gave birth to a boy in front of all the present Romans. At first the human beings were in consternation, but this only lasted for a moment. Then they came to their senses and realized the truth. But then the veneration and adoration for the mother and her child turned into raging, uncontrolled rage. In an angry rage, the rabble seized the helpless woman and the newborn and defenseless child, dragged them outside the gates of the city and stoned them to death. There are many legends surrounding the miraculous story of Pope Joan, and it is said that she dressed up as a man out of love and lived as such. Joan was born in Ingelheim on the Rhine in 818, the daughter of an Anglo-Saxon monk. This is not certain, but it could just as well have been Mainz, as there is no agreement on this. However, this does not detract from the whole thing, because two things are clear. Joan was very talented and had outstanding gifts of the spirit gifts of consciousness. She was also a very pretty girl, who attracted attention because of her beauty. At the age of 12, Joan left her parents' house for a young monk whom she loved. In order to stay with the young man, she slipped into men's clothes. So she moved in with her lover and soon found accommodation in Fulda Abbey, where she pretended to be John the English. The two of them diligently studied writings together in the library during the day, and at night they gave themselves over to their love in the company of each other. However, they always had to expect that their betrayal would be discovered, which could have had dire consequences for them. For this reason, they decided to flee and left the abbey. They made a pilgrimage to England, reached Switzerland via France, and then headed south to continue their pilgrimage to Athens in Greece. In Athens, Joan's lover fell ill and died, after which she went to Rome to work as a notary, while she continued to dress like a man, live and act like one, and also pretend to be one. Soon she changed her job to teach at the school of the Greeks. After a short time she was no longer interested in this job, so she signed up to teach at Martin Monastery. Over the years, Joan became known as John, and a personality to whom great respect was paid. Her students admired her eloquence as much as the philosophers appreciated her knowledge and wisdom. Soon her theological knowledge was also no longer a secret among the cardinals. Soon she entered and left the Pope's residence, while her generosity made her particularly popular with the courtiers. She was well aware of her knowledge and ability and all her talents, and she knew how to use them with exemplary skill. So it was that when Pope Leo IV died in 855, her great hour came and she was unanimously elected as his successor. With Joan sat a female human being on the throne of the Pope for the first time in living memory. And the incredible thing was that no human being knew or even suspected anything about it except one, Joan's valet. The valet was passionately attached to the beautiful pontiff, and they both knew how to have beautiful and intimate hours of togetherness, not only at night in the papal chambers, but also at daily times, when the business and duties of Joan allowed. The consequences of this did not, of course, go unnoticed. Joan became pregnant. The pregnancy was not a problem for her, however, because she was able to hide her condition very well under the rampant papal robes of the time. She managed to do this throughout her pregnancy, before she was struck by bad luck in the procession and fell down an alley. In honor of Pope Joan, who had not only arch-conservative Catholics as her followers, but also quite outgoing, open-minded believers, some followers erected a memorial stone and a statue of a woman in which a newborn boy was also integrated. This statue was then placed in the alley where Joan came down and gave birth to her child, while by papal decree this alley was henceforth avoided and forbidden for processions. Some 500 years after the events described above, the memorial stone and the statue of a woman and her boy were found under rubble in the same alley. According to the popes and priests of all kinds and the Catholic faith, Joan had brought unspeakable and inconceivable shame on the papacy, which is why she was banned from the papal chronicle and history, just as the alley of shame was banned from being walked on by a pope or in processions, etc. Nevertheless, around 1400 a bust of the Pope was erected in Siena Cathedral, against the will of the Pope, with the inscription, John VIII, a woman from England. The statue remained in the cathedral for 200 years before Pope Clement VIII, 1592–1605, by an arbitrary decision, transformed the female Pope Joan into a man, and gave her the name of Pope Zechariah, who nevertheless does not appear in the papal rolls and papal records of the year 855 until 857, nor does the name of John VIII, who was indeed Joan. After the stoning to death of Pope Joan, alias John VIII, at the end of 857, a pope was not immediately elected again. The shock suffered by the Vatican dignitaries was so great that it was some time after Joan's death that they returned to the election of the Pope, and in 858 they elected Pope Nicholas I in 858 to 867. But Pope John VIII, and thus Pope Joan I, was simply never allowed to have lived and worn the papal crown, which is why her existence as John V was simply erased from the registers and writings, in the erroneous belief that the truth would never be handed down, and that the existence of John VIII or even Joan V could simply be undone. In place of John III, John V, the dignitaries invented the imaginary Pope Benedict III in short, who was inserted in the papal chronicle and other writings in place of the name John VIII for Joan I in 872, in order to put the crown on all the slander of the existence of John I. A pope was elected who was given the name John VIII, which, according to the ecclesiastical dignitaries of the time, made the existence of John III and John VIII from 855 to 858 completely obscure and erased and destroyed. But with this, those responsible had cut their fingers, as well as all today's Catholic white, black, red and violet tuxedos who deny the existence of Joan I or as John V. At that time. But slander and lies have never been a weakness of the Catholic Church since time immemorial, because it is known that the opposite is true. Just think of all the slanders and lies of the Catholic Church, especially during the time of the murderous Inquisition, when millions of human lives were murdered, destroyed, and destroyed. But this church has never been concerned about this in a repentant way. On the contrary, in the area of the next and highest dignitaries of the Pope, after the incident with Joan Johannes VIII, there was a deeply rooted fear that a woman could once again take possession of the Holy See of Peter in an audacious and disgraceful way. So a means was devised and invented for the enthronement of a new pope to prevent similarly disgraceful things from happening again. Each new pope to be elected was to be examined and evaluated according to his sex, and a special ritual was devised for this purpose, together with an invention that was as important as the look and touch of the dignitary who was to carry out the test. The truth of the matter was that before the election of Nicholas III as Pope, the dignitaries commissioned 2 stone chairs from a stonemason to serve the newly conceived ritual of testing the manhood of the person to be elected Pope. The chairs were 2 stone chairs with a semicircular backrest, the seat of which had a wide slit at the front that widened into a large hole in the middle of the seat. If a church dignitary was now chosen as a papal aspirant, he had to sit on one of these chairs, with his buttocks bare, of course. The nakedness was well hidden under the flowing robe, so nobody saw anything. On the perforated chair, the Pope candidate had to sit in such a way that his genitals were hanging flat in the hole of the chair and hung down through it. Then the new pontiff, who was not yet crowned, had to put up with a dignitary in front lifting his robe to look under it and into the slit of the seat to see the sex of the sitter's genitals. The examiner then had to use his right hand to go under the robe to check the genitals by touching them all, around and then tugging at them roughly to make sure they were genuine and not just the devil's deception or just a dummy. From then on, all this was done publicly, under the gaze of all the clergy present and all the people. If the test was positive, which was always the case from then on, the people and the dignitaries burst out in jubilant and often fanatical and frenetic howling. The ceremonial was prescribed and controlled in such a way that if the test was positive, the people would cry and cheer unrestrainedly for a long time. Habet, habet, which meant he has. When the shouting and howling of the people had finally ceased, only then was the chosen one elected Pope and crowned as such. From 858 to 1099, the clergy carried out this type of sex foundation for the new pontiffs in absolute secrecy, after which, only from 1099 onwards were the 2 chairs presented to the people and the sex foundations carried out in public. Until the 16th century, this method of determining the sexes was common practice for the new popes, before this ritual was abolished as sanguinely as it had been invented and had found its existence. And of course, today, the representatives and dignitaries of the Catholic Church do not want to know the truth of these facts, any more than they do Pope Joan I, who fooled the entire Catholic community of the known world at that time, all Catholic dignitaries and priests, as well as the Pope's closest confidants, and thus the entire Vatican.
Now the question whether there is more recorded in your annals than what I have listed, which I have formulated in memory of your father's Fath's explanations.
In fact, there are records in this regard which trace back to my grandfather Ezekiel, and which confirm exactly what you wrote in memory of my father's explanations. The records also show clearly that the events surrounding Pope Joan of Arc and the Catholic Church respectively caused the leaders of the Vatican and the Catholic Church to lose their composure completely, as they acted chaotically in every respect. This is how they first called the Pope Zacharias, but this name was also erased from the history of the Pope, as was John VIII, as the Pope called herself. Pope Joan, respectively Pope John VIII, was then officially replaced by a papal figure known as Benedict III, who was, however, freely invented by the Vatican colonels through a reprehensible web of lies and thus never existed. Subsequently, an official Pope John VIII was not elected until 872, and he resided in the Vatican for 10 years until 882. The true story of Pope Joan I, alias John the Faith, was thus completely taken ad absurdum by the Vatican, and the papal story was also thoroughly falsified by putting an imaginary Pope Benedict III in her place and spreading a fake story. The true story goes that before the consecration of Benedict III, that is to say, before the 29th of September 855, when Pope Joan V was ordained as John VIII, the Vatican librarian Anastasius attempted to force an election of a pope with the help of the German Emperor Louis II. Joan, however, had a skillful way of negotiating with the imperial envoys and, as a result of a popular uprising, managed to undermine and prevent the librarian's plan. Later, the librarian Anastasius became the highly controversial head of the papal court of Pope Hadrian II, who ruled the Vatican from 867 to 872. In his behavior regarding the attempt to elect the pope by force, the whole thing was like a coup d'etat, which showed in its own way that the emperor's interference in the church played a major role and that the church was a pawn in the political power game. Pope Joan I distinguished herself in the defense of the church's interests, especially against the authoritarian claims of the Frankish kings and their vassals. Pope Joan, I was a patron of the arts who enjoyed remarkable social and economic prosperity after the dramatic beginnings of her papacy. Like Leo IV, of whom she was the successor, she defended the papal seat against the Eastern Church. But her efforts had only a temporary effect until the question of the schism, respectively the division of the church between Photius and Hadrian II, was resolved. The division of the church was based on the refusal to submit to the Pope and the bishops under his authority. Well, the Vatican's lie went even further, which has been preserved to this day. So the lie was created that the alleged and freely invented Pope Benedict III died on 17th April 858 and was buried in St. Peter's. In reality, however, a dead beggar was dressed in a papal strobe and buried in place of the alleged Benedict III, and whatever stories about this never-existing pope have been handed down in writing since 858 and are also considered true today, are fundamentally lies or are based on actions, etc., that can be traced back to Pope Joan I, alias Pope John VIII.
Thank you. These are again some new facts that Svath has not told me, but which I guess he was certainly aware of.
He knew about these things because we talked about them several times.
Then a question about the comet respectively planet, which is supposed to come into the inner solar system every 3,600 years, and which was already known to the Sumerians and Egyptians. It was called Nibiru and Annanuki. To my knowledge, if I remember correctly, it was also known to the ancestors of the Celts, or so you said at the 467th official contact conversation in June 2008. At that time, you also spoke of the Destroyer, which came from your space-time structure and which you had rendered harmless. But you also spoke of the spacewalker known from the ancestors of the Celts, Sumerians, and Egyptians as a destroyer. How is this to be understood?
The ancestors of the Celts, but also the Sumerians and Egyptians, use the term destroyer. So they used the same name as we did for the wandering planet, which entered the SOL system from our space-time structure through a dimensional gate.
So for many thousands of years, there were two such spacewalkers with the same names in our solar system.
That is correct. We called the wandering planet from the Kuiper belt Kuiper Destroyer. The one that broke into the SOL system from our space-time structure we simply called Destroyer. This one, as you say, we eliminated years ago, while the other one, the Kuiper Destroyer, continues to orbit the SOL system.
So that's the way things look and can now be understood. So I can also imagine that the so-called Planet X, which astronomers discovered in 1983 far from Earth, could be the Kuiper Destroyer.
This is indeed to be assumed. Unfortunately, I do not know the actual facts of this observation, if there was one at all. But that the Kuiper Destroyer continues to make its way through the SOL system as ever is an undeniable fact. But what the real truth of this is that it was tracked down and observed far away from Earth in 1983, of which I know nothing. Since we cannot record every little detail of all the events and happenings that take place on Earth, because we only deal with things that are important for our records, it is possible that such an observation from 1983 is not known to us.
I know that. And many things you have clarified over the years, because I have insisted that you do so, also with regard to foresight and prediction.
That really only happened because you wanted to have predictions, and you assumed that Earth humans would become more reasonable if you published everything.
Which unfortunately was a shot in the dark, because the human beings of Earth did not take your predictions seriously, nor did mine. All the media, to whom I have also sent my predictions since 1950, also did not find it necessary to publish them. Everything simply went into the trash, and it was not even deemed necessary to respond to my predictions. Today, now that my predictions have been and continue to be confirmed worldwide, there is now a great clamor for all the worldwide disasters concerning climate, nature, etc., as I have predicted, with some major speakers standing out and taking credit for it. But that is all, because they are not doing anything but making themselves great with all the evils, disasters, and evil and destructive things that are happening. So climate conferences are also being held, costing millions of francs, euros, and dollars, and polluting the air with all kinds of dirt, which is completely absurd. All they do is take stupid decisions which are not implemented, and which would be long outdated if they were implemented, because humanity has now grown by hundreds of millions or even 1 or 2 billion, 1,000, or 2,000, and all the problems have increased, and all the evils and disasters have increased even more. And that the entire population of the Earth has also fallen into the delusion that, despite the overpopulation which is rampant today and the disasters which have arisen and continue to arise from it, the descendant witness is a purely private matter, which shows how briefly and how irrationally people think and act. None of the supposedly so intelligent people who take part in climate conferences or who shout pro and con for it also think of all this, because on the one hand their intelligence, their reason, and their reason do not reach so far that they can grasp and understand the effective facts, and on the other hand, they do not care about the future of the world and its humanity anyway. Their motto is simple: I live today and enjoy life and wealth, but the flood or the end of the world may come after me. So they are not concerned about what the future will bring. So they are also not concerned about the fundamental evil that causes all the destruction of nature and the climate and every other catastrophe, namely the excessive population growth. It alone is the source of everything, because it creates enormous quantities of CO2, which is causing rapid global warming, as well as methane gas, which escapes from the seafloor and into the atmosphere wherever the permafrost thaws, and also contributes to global warming. But these are not the only evils that result from overpopulation, as there is also enormous marine and other water pollution, as well as air pollution, all of which contribute to new natural disasters. And what also results in a very bad way is the fact that global warming is causing all the glaciers in the world to melt, as well as the huge masses of ice in Greenland and in the Arctic and Antarctic. But if the ice masses of Greenland, of all the glaciers and of the North and South poles melt to a much greater extent than is already the case today, causing the oceans to rise, this will be even more the case in the future. Depending on how the overpopulation grows, the more pollutants are produced that destroy nature and the atmosphere as well as warm the climate. These pollutants will cause all glaciers around the world to melt even faster, as will the Greenland ice sheet and the ice of the Arctic and Antarctic. This means, however, that if humanity continues to push ahead with its overpopulation and does not stop it by means of a global birth control system, which also drastically reduces it, the disasters will become more frequent, more extensive, and more powerful. Globally, the ice sheets of Greenland's glaciers and the poles are melting faster and faster, which means that the water in the oceans will also rise much faster and flood human settlements. Settlements, villages, and towns built close to the sea will sink faster and faster into the rising waters, which may be the case in several places in just 100 years. Depending on how the overpopulation continues to grow irresponsibly, the oceans could be as much as 2 meters above the current sea level in 100 years' time and continue to rise at an ever faster rate. It is to be feared that, as a result of the inexorably increasing global warming, the oceans will ultimately rise by 1.25 to 1.5 meters every 10 years, that is to say, by 15 to 18 meters in 100 years. And finally, much of the land and human settlements, villages and towns will be swallowed up by the sea, which is not more than 72 meters above the current sea level. Millions and even billions of human beings will have to flee from the rising seawaters and will lose their homes. And the only one to blame for this is the human being of Earth, who are foolishly and senselessly increasing their population, not realizing that overpopulation alone is the cause of all the ever-increasing human ills, the immense natural disasters, and global warming. And the more overpopulation increases, the more all evils such as crime, criminality, hatred, jealousy, revenge and retribution, as well as murder and manslaughter, robbery, new diseases and epidemics multiply. The already widespread indifference of the human beings among each other and against each other, as well as the groupings of antisocial and extreme and radical elements, are also increasing, as are terrorism and wars of all kinds. But the ecological balance of nature is also being increasingly destroyed, which means that the interrelationships between all life forms and their entire environment are being destroyed. The entire balance of nature is increasingly being shaken, just as the Earth itself is also rebelling as a result of all the catastrophic damage and destruction caused by human beings to the planet. The waters, the land, the atmosphere, the climate, and the Earth's resources. And as the Earth defends itself against human madness, natural disasters are also on the increase. With their strength and magnitude, storms and tempests becoming more and more powerful, as well as earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, which the human being is no longer able to defend himself against. Landslides will also become more frequent and more powerful, because the permafrost is disintegrating due to global warming and the rocks are losing their grip. This, however, causes the methane gas bound in the permafrost to dissolve, as also happens in the permanent cold zones in the ground, which is frozen by permafrost. And all this and much more, whole populations of animals and creatures are being wiped out by humans. The seas and lakes, as well as streams and rivers, are being fished out, which also contributes to the fact that the ecosystem can no longer function. The atmosphere is also polluted by CO2, more and more methane gas, and many of the poisons produced by human beings, many of which are deposited in the soil and groundwater, which are then absorbed by the human beings through vegetables and drinking water, leading to allergies, diseases, and immune deficiencies. The dirt alone, which gets into the atmosphere through motor vehicles, ships and airplanes, as well as through working machines, is enormously large and causes a lot of destruction, affects the whole nature and the health of the human beings. Then there are the sports involving planes, motorboats, cars, racing cars and goods vehicles, etc., which should be banned as a matter of principle, because they too throw huge quantities of dirt into the air, polluting the air, soil, and plants, which also affects all the animals, and human beings. In this respect alone, the question arises as to why stupid climate conferences are held if such moronic sports are not banned altogether. It also wonders why road traffic with motor vehicles is not drastically reduced in view of the fact that only those people who cannot use public transport for their own transport and travel are allowed to drive a vehicle. There should also be a ban on oil and coal-fired power stations, which also pollute the atmosphere and the earth with their emissions from fossil fuels, which would therefore have to be replaced by wind, solar, hydroelectric, and geothermal power stations, which are the only means of producing clean electrical energy. Nuclear power stations would also have to be banned, and not just because of nuclear waste.
This is unfortunately the bitter truth that many people will not be happy about, especially not those who practice motorsports and those who drive motor vehicles that they do not really need. But how do you know the measure of about 72 meters that you mentioned in relation to the rise in sea level? I, for my part, did not tell you this number, and I also do not remember Quetzal, my daughter, or others talking to you about it. However, the measure given agrees with our calculations.
It was your father, Svath, dear friend, who told me the facts in the late 1940s. Unfortunately, these things have never been recorded in contact reports. Actual contact reports were first made with Asket, although these were also sparse. Only when Simyase, your daughter, got in contact with me, there have been continuous reports of conversations. But up to and including today's conversation, only their 5-10 conversations recorded in writing exist, whereas from 1975 until today, we have had 971 personal conversations. These personal conversations also included Quetzal, Simya-Se, Plaja, Asket, and many others.
Your information regarding the number of our contacts agrees with my notes.
Something else. Many of the great Nazis fled to Argentina at the end of the Second World War, and they also took secret plans of flying discs with them.
Then it happened, as happened at Area 51, that suddenly many different unknown flying objects were sighted over the country, called UFOs. In Argentina, it was the German Nazi engineers and Nazi greats who had fled, and at Area 51, it was the German Nazi engineers who had been captured by the USA and enlisted to build flying discs and rockets, etc., for which these Nazis had their past simply erased and were granted American citizenship. The question: there are still various reports of UFOs in areas of Mexico and Argentina and elsewhere in South America, as well as in the USA. What is to be thought of? Do old Nazi engineers still work in Argentina? And are strange flying apparatus still being worked on in Area 51, which are then observed as UFOs?
For a number of years now, we have not made any special efforts to deal with these things, because they are no longer of any importance to us, so we only deal with them sporadically. Our findings, however, are that there is always something to be found in relation to so-called UFO observations. It is true that with regard to such observations, which are made from time to time all over the world, today not as many unknown objects are observed as in the past from Area 51 and from Argentina, etc., and also not with regard to our and our allies' flying apparatus, but they still appear sporadically. The main phase of alien terrestrial missile development is over, for its main period was during the Second World War and then during the so-called Cold War. However, the fact that UFO observations are repeatedly reported around the world is that these are usually natural phenomena which can also be photographed or filmed under certain circumstances. Illusions and optical irritations are also common. Those photos and films, however, which are sensational in UFO circles, are usually deliberate fakes produced by computers. It is not uncommon for your photos to be falsified and misused for this purpose, whereby photo montages and animated films are produced. Only very few pictures show real objects, which can be interpreted as flying apparatus or as UFOs. Since the 1980s, when computer technology emerged and can be used in a private way by anyone who can handle it, there have been countless fake pictures and films concerning UFOs or unknown flying objects, respectively, which circulate in UFO circles and are found to be real. Today, computer technology is so far developed that fakes can hardly or not at all be recognized. But when you took your pictures in the 1970s, these computer possibilities did not exist yet, because only years later computers were produced that could also be used in private life. And if you had wanted to fake photos, it would have required immense financial means, which you demonstrably did not have, and also not a necessary photo and film studio, without which your pictures and films could not have been made. This apart from the fact that you were a layman in the field of film and photography. So the only possibility was that you could actually take real pictures with regard to our flying apparatus, for which there are also various witnesses.
Thank you, your explanation covers more than I wanted to know. But I would like to say that I would be very pleased if you would come to my office after your proofreading work, and we could talk a little more. It does not have to be any different than before, simply that we can talk without it having to be a public conversation, as is also the case with Florina and Injana. Somehow I find such private conversations simply relaxing.
I can well understand that, because our private visits and conversations also mean a lot to me. I was also told by Injana and Florina that it is always relaxing for them.
I do not include in my list of conversations the non-public visits and conversations with you, Florina and Injana and others, but only those which are related to the mission and to our group concerns and to official discussions.
It would also be going too far if you wanted to record all these purely private visits and conversations in numbers. The list is quite sufficient in terms of official personal visits and conversations and telepathic connections, and the names of all the persons you have had or still have contacts with.
Exactly, I also think so.
I have two more questions on a purely private basis. When we have clarified these, I have to go, but when I will visit you again, I do not know yet.
If the time is not too long. But bring forward your questions.